Closed captioning for the professors is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury and wrongful death law firm in Chicago.
A recent article in The Economist magazine called Chicago the capital of corruption. But does it have to be that way? Can real reform ever take place? That's the focus of our discussion on today's edition of The Professors. Joining us today to talk about Chicago and Illinois corruption are Miriam Judar, a community lawyer with the Citizen Advocacy Center, Dick Simpson, head of the Political Science Department at UIC and a former Chicago alderman, Nick Panamitros, an attorney, a professor at Kennedy King College, UIC, and Harper College, and Ann Lucene, a law professor at the John Marshall School of Law. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So Chicago, the most corrupt city in the world, I guess, huh? I can't imagine, right? I mean,
That's
go
what
figure.
The Economist
That's what The Economist
Let's
says.
begin with this. What does corruption mean?
That's a good question.
And there's a simple way to test it, and we did in our study. If you look at convictions by the U.S. Attorney in every district in the United States from 1976 to 2010, there have been 1,848 convictions in the state of Illinois, 1,531 in the metropolitan region. In terms of the metropolitan region, that's more than New York or Los Angeles or any other place that you can imagine. And that's not all corruption, obviously. There's a lot more corruption than just the people convicted in federal court. But that means they've been before a jury. That means they've been convicted in court. That means there's been full evidence presented. Sure. So there's not much doubt that those people are guilty.
If corruption is an abuse of power, and it's obviously considerably more than just something that was illegal. I was amazed when I looked up the definition of corruption and found it didn't have the word illegal in it. It's abuse of corruption.
So what kinds of things? What kinds of things are people corruption?
Well, obviously you'd have bribery and you'd have embezzlement. Everybody would agree on that. But then when I start seeing people saying, well, nepotism, favoritism, cronyism, I begin to wonder if we haven't diluted it. If you include all of those, I think there would be a lot more places that are corrupt.
But Lucene, you know, you asked, your first question was, what is corruption? You know, and they say that Chicago is the most corrupt city in the world. What's considered corruption?
Not in the world, only in the United States.
Okay.
Oh, you said the world, so...
It said the world in the economy.
Yeah, so, you know, what's considered corruption in the United States in a lot of countries wouldn't be corruption.
Absolutely not.
So,
it would be business as usual.
It would be business as usual. And so, and then from state to state, on state laws, sometimes there's a change of definition. What may be corrupt in one state may not be as corrupt in another state. But definitely, internationally speaking, there's a huge, big range of definition there, corruption.
Well, and certainly we shouldn't, I don't think we should focus on the fact that it's the most corrupt. I mean, the bottom line is it's corrupt. We know it's corrupt. There's many convictions that we can account for, but beyond the convictions, there's a lot of unethical behavior. So there's the abuse of power that's not necessarily illegal, but unethical. So whether it's stringing contracts, which isn't illegal, but it's not really ethical from a procurement standpoint, or the nepotism or patronage, you can't really calculate those costs.
And very important point. Unfortunately, though, these conversations about corruption and the kind of corruption you're talking about, which I appreciate your definition, which may not be illegal, are really considered nationally to be the Chicago way, right? So people have this perception that nepotism is what happens here consistently. Let me ask you this question: compared to other places in our country, how does Chicago hold up? I mean, you know, obviously.
How far back do you want to go?
Well, we can go as far back as you'd like to go. We've got 30 minutes.
I've always been amazed that whenever I see cities that have one ethnic group coming in after another, mostly poor people, and they need services, that they end up finding themselves in what we would now, looking back, would call corruption. I mean, Jane Addams talked about that in the 1890s.
Our first corruption trial was 1869.
That could
A series of 14 people were involved. It was a very simple corruption crime. They had a contract to paint City Hall, meaning with paint. The contractor used whitewash. When it rained, it was sort of obvious they didn't get a fair deal. 4 aldermen went to jail. Another series of county commissioners and aldermen were defeated in the next election.
Sure.
So
This
we've
is
had
1969, you meant.
1869.
It sounds like it could be 1969 also.
150
Yeah.
years of great corruption history in Illinois.
I was amazed to discover that in the 1890s, an English visitor said, you know, you have Boodle here. Boodle, I'd forgotten Boodle was the old name for graft.
Yes.
And he said, Boodle, you're so proud of your accomplishments, your universities, what you've built here since the Great Fire, and you're also proud of how you operate on a kind of a graft level with your Boodle. And he said, I don't know which you're prouder of, your accomplishments or your Boodle.
Wow.
You hit on
And it's been true ever
you,
since.
You hit on something. You said poor people. You know, Chicago is up until now has been quite segregated compared to many other cities. And having an immigrant
I would say now as well, but that's
another
conversation, another
we still
show.
have a
Exactly.
segregation
We'll do a
index of
separate
82.
show, and you'll
Yeah.
host it too. Segregated and poor immigrants, and going back to what we talked about, definition of corruption, immigrants will still behave in the United States the same as they did, or they'll want to sort of go back to their behavior back in the old country. And so what might not be ethical here, but was ethical in Poland or Greece or whatever country, somehow comes back to Chicago. And I think Chicago's immigrant population has something to do with that.
It does, but what's more central is that we develop machine politics. Partly because of the immigrants, we did that, but since we've had a political machine since 1871, it's almost coterminous with our corruption era. The first machine was put together by introducing the barkeepers and the brothel keepers to the politicians and showing them they had a common interest. The barkeepers and the brothel keepers would give bribes, but in the bar you could get a nice beer and a lunch if you only hopped in a wagon and voted 5 times in the election for the right candidates. In addition, the politicians would then keep the police from raiding the bars and the whorehouses. That's been our tradition, and it wasn't just because it was immigrants that helped create this sort of atmosphere.
Now let me ask you a question though, because it's you talk about obviously the alderman and that sort of thing. You were an alderman.
Yes.
And you've done work on corruption in the city council. Now the city council actually has a new board of ethics that we just voted for. But how bad is the problem within our city council specifically?
Well, there have been, since 1976, 31 aldermen convicted in federal court of corruption. 2 died before they could be convicted and sent away, and 2 are pending trial currently. That's a worse crime zone than the worst ghetto in the city of Chicago. So I like to tell my students the 2 dangerous places in the state of Illinois are the city council chambers and the governor's mansion.
Sure, absolutely.
4 of the last 7 governors have gone to jail.
Yeah.
Well, in Illinois, we have weak laws, weak statutes, weak enforcement of those laws, and when we do have laws with any teeth in them, again, that weak enforcement, we have historically a lack of campaign finance regulations, unlike, say, Montana, which, at least prior to the Citizens United ruling, had a lot of campaign finance regulations.
Okay,
and then we have a lack of civic education.
That's important, yes.
Oh, come
I got to
on
stop
now.
you there, wait, no, because I
Did
know
you
your
go
opinion
to-
on
did you go
civic,
to
on,
the-
go
did
ahead.
you-
I
How
knew this was
many of
coming
us
on
here
the
went to
campaign
the,
finance.
to the Illinois schools? I did.
I did.
Okay, did you?
High school?
Yes, elementary
did
and
not.
high
I
school.
did not.
Did you, Dick?
I was in
Partially,
Houston.
but not completely.
Okay.
We were
Those of
taught
us
how to
who
be
went
cowboys.
through
We weren't taught
Illinois
how to be
schools had to pass examinations in the U.S. Constitution and the Illinois Constitution, and if you made it through high school into your senior year, in order to graduate, you had to pass a civics examination, which included Illinois and Chicago
So
government.
you're suggesting
So,
that civics
come on, there's
education...
civics
Right now,
education.
Illinois has one of the weakest civic education requirements as any other state in our nation. And
Currently.
Given our history of corruption, you would think that we would have the opposite, so that we
You
can
know,
try to
all
fight
of those
that.
civic
all of those
education have to-
governors took the same examinations that I did.
Yeah, but...
Well,
Even,
the
even
civic
more,
education
before you
issue
pass
is
the
a
same
long-term
ethics test that I have to
solution.
pass every
But
year.
we're talking
Civic
about
education is a
bribery,
long-term solution.
stealing, lying. You don't need to go.
Well, there
you don't
are
need the civic
short-term-
literacy to know you don't steal, you don't lie, you don't.
Yeah,
well, if you want to
coerce.
fight the Chicago way or the machine
That might
in
be
Illinois,
part of the problem because
then
civic literacy is beyond. This is something that's tangential with civic literacy, but this has to do with just plain ethics. I mean, you don't steal, you don't bribe, you don't lie.
No. To her point, though, we're not necessarily talking about literacy, civic literacy for the politicians. We're talking about for the people to hold them accountable.
I'm talking about the people. I mean, people should
to
know.
hold them accountable.
You don't steal, you don't bribe, you don't.
But what she's talking about, I think, would then equip people to be more powerful and to hold their politicians more accountable.
But Illinois
Civic
has
literacy,
constitutional law classes, and it doesn't work. So obviously, it's not effectuating.
Our requirements are paltry. Period.
And
we've lost the civic mission of our public schools.
My daughter is taking the Illinois Constitution exam right now, and it's about how many years the senators are supposed to be in power. How many years is the House of Representatives?
It's rote memorization.
It has nothing to do with ethics or behavior.
We'd like to see hands-on applied civic education where students actually can, achieve agency, get involved, whether it's at their school, whether it's, with their class, whether it's beyond the school walls and in their community, and actually see results, see their agency.
There's a good parallel. Everybody is very pleased with the Burnham Plan of 1909. The Burnham Plan didn't enact itself. What happened was...
Why don't you explain that for us?
Well, the Burnham Plan was a great design of what the city should be. It had the lakefront, it had a funny city hall, which fortunately we didn't implement. It had those long boulevards, the nice avenues that cut across the street, across the city. And it was trying to make the place beautiful because, let's face it, none of us would really want to have lived in Chicago most of the time in the 1890s or something. It was crowded, it was dirty, it was noisy. You still had animals running up and down the street. It was just a terrible place in those things. And Burnham said, why don't we make the city beautiful? And he drew a nice plan, and he had the Civic Federation the Civic Committee working with him. But that's not what implemented the Burnham Plan. What implemented the Burnham Plan was what was called the Wacker Manual, like the Wacker Drive that runs around the city in his name. The Wacker Manual was a boiled-down high school version of the Burnham Plan that was taught for 20 years, and it got the citizens willing to adopt the kinds of referendums that were necessary to fund the bridge over Michigan Avenue, everything else that we see. We really need, in following up on your suggestion, what we need to do is not teach, how many people are on the state Supreme Court. Who cares?
Right.
What we need to teach are things
I told you don't care what I do.
But it's trivial.
You're a law professor, that's why.
If I don't even teach how a bill becomes a law, because if I can convince my students to care about what they want to pass, they'll figure out the mechanics. It's not the mechanics you teach. But we don't teach first of all, we no longer have a civics requirement in the public schools. Second, if we did, we'd never have taught the cost of corruption, the cause of corruption, and the cure of corruption.
What is the cost of corruption?
Cost of corruption is at least $500 million a year per taxpayer in Illinois, for all the taxpayers.
I keep hearing that mostly from very conservative businessmen. Every time I go to these committees and I ask them about that, they say, well, everybody knows it. I said, how did you arrive at that figure? Everybody knows it.
Because they copy it from me, and I will admit it's a very... No, my figure is the one that's used.
Okay.
And it's used because we do have some numbers. We know in the hired truck scandal, when they didn't use the trucks, that it cost roughly $24 million. We also
how did it, tell me how you got there?
Because that's the price that we paid for the trucks we didn't use, which came out in the court case, and the series of court cases that were called the hired truck scandal. So we can estimate individual costs. What we can't estimate as well is some of the other costs that are involved. And so it is, in fact, a guess. It's a guess based on a series of other numbers produced on individual parts of corruption. But then you have to add in, you were talking about patronage and nepotism earlier, how much does it cost if you have 2 workers and only one is working? Because they're working the precinct to get their job. And for all of those, you have to do an estimate. What is even worse, and we haven't been able to get an economist yet, when you have the porch fall down like it did in Lincoln Park and a number of people are killed, what's that life worth that is lost? But you begin to look across all the prices it takes to get the FBI, the U.S. Attorney, the courts to prosecute the cases, and it gets to be a very large number. So we're off by $100 million. If it's only $400 million a year, it's still too much money that's being wasted because nothing good is coming out of it in terms of better streets, better roads, or whatever.
Now you're saying wasted, and I think you're probably going to ask the same thing I am. That wasted.
Not really.
It's obvious it's going to somebody.
Right.
And the question is why somebody wants that money and why somebody else wants them to keep it. That has always amazed me. Somebody is profiting from it, and very often I find it's the people who are yelling, "Oh, there's so much corruption."
Oh, it's
Let me-
often
well,
the
you know what?
businessmen,
Let me
sure.
ask a question here. It's about bribes, it's about money a lot of times, right? Don't we think that these politicians are being underpaid? And if we paid them a little bit more, that perhaps
I agree.
they
No,
would
there's-
they wouldn't
when
go
I
for the
was-
debate.
when I was
Let me
older-
say this.
yeah, but let me
you talk
answer your
about the
question
millions
directly.
of dollars. If you just pay them a little bit more and they're happy, because you're a politician
Well,
yourself.
let him answer,
Yes,
let him
the
answer
amount
the
of
question.
work you
Let him
do
answer
to
the question. Go
When
ahead.
I was alderman, I was paid $8,000 a year.
Wow.
Is that a lot?
Aldermen today are paid $103,000.
But-
Do you
but for the
think the
amount of
difference
work-
has made the aldermen today any less corrupt because we're still sending them to jail at the same rate?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and certainly in local government, you know, our part-time elected officials are making a lot less.
Yeah.
And ostensibly, a lot of them go into public service because they really care about public service. But going back to
State reps make $67,000 a year.
yeah.
Right.
And you know, I'm sorry.
No, it's
Congressman,
okay. I
just
wanted
happen
to
have these
return to
numbers
what Dick
in-
was saying about
Sure.
the cost of corruption. I mean, and what he was saying towards the end was that really the costs are incalculable, especially when you think about the civic shutout. All the people who would have liked to maybe participate in their government decision-making process, but didn't know how to because they didn't learn it in school, and because there are anti-democratic statutes and ordinances and policies that are 7,000 plus local governments, you know, units of local governments in Illinois have. It creates civic shutout, and people who would otherwise be monitoring local government, trying to keep them accountable, they feel a sense of hopelessness.
Now, you
and
mentioned
helplessness.
in your conversation a little earlier campaign finance reform, right? And we just did a show on term limits, and you know, I know Professor Luzine does not, and I'd like to hear your opinion because you know, she suggested maybe finance reform, campaign finance reform would help, but your position is that it would not. And I've read
Not
actually.
true. I believe totally in disclosure.
Okay.
And I have told people in the media they do a terrible job of listing with each candidate
that's a good
who the big contributors are. At least we learned that Sheldon Adelson was the man behind Newt Gingrich, right? We managed to find that out. But we don't often hear that here on the Illinois level. But you start putting in limits, and I will remind you of one thing. When I worked for the legislature, we put those in. And there was a rule that we had. If Ann Lucene can figure out a way around this, in 10 minutes, we won't enact it. And I could usually find a way around it.
Okay.
I'd like to go back to something that Dick said, that the corruption's been the same, although the salaries have increased. I beg to differ, and the reason why, back in the day, the transparency wasn't there. And so I think if there was a transparency back in the day, that a lot more aldermen would have been convicted for
It had
crimes.
nothing to do with the transparency. They
There was
were
no
all
way to
convicted by
discover.
No, but the U.S. attorney convicted all of them, and I mean because, frankly, our state's attorney and our attorney general have convicted almost no one.
You would need
So
to, you
it's
would need
the
to
feds.
equalize. You would need to equalize the transparency to make that statement, because I beg to differ. With the way electronics is today and the way media is, and there's much more transparency than there was 50, 60, 70 years ago.
There's more
But
transparency,
it might
but
not
it
be
has
meaningful
the same corruption.
transparency.
If it's still the same,
how
I'm
is
saying
that
that it would
data
be more back in the day.
how is that data collected, and
you
so
can't
that people can
discover
actually
that.
use it?
Well, I mean, most of the stuff, for instance, the campaign finance information. I mean, I take my students to a website called Open Secrets, and we go through the different candidates and their funders and their donors, and so much of this information is there. It's public information.
Well,
it's
Open
on,
Secrets
right.
is
But
a
50,
unique.
60 years ago, it was
No,
no
that's
disclosure.
fine. That's to your point.
Yeah.
That's fine.
And
but-
so
was no
I beg to
disclosure.
differ. I
Yeah.
think that if you paid them more, that you'd see less. And
Okay.
you know what? 105 seems like a lot, but you were an alderman. How much work was it?
Same amount,
Yeah.
60, 70 hours a week, at a minimum.
You know,
And
I think-
campaigning and everything else?
No, I'm talking about campaigning. I'm talking
talking
about
about
just
just the
normal
work.
day-to-day. Aldermen work very hard.
I don't want to get bogged
So-
down in campaign finance, though, because there's so many other reforms. I mean, Illinois needs a
Sure.
multifaceted approach to
Yes.
reforming this long history of corruption. It's
And
gonna-
actually, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
You make a
All right,
very
let
good. No,
me-
no, no,
let
She
me
makes a
ask
good
you
point.
one thing.
Wait a second. I want to say this, what you're saying, because California, for instance, and this is a very important point. We talk about Illinois, and we've talked about, say, Mike Madigan was just reelected overwhelmingly, and you look at the power that that he has and other folks in the state have. in terms of redistricting. And that's what I think is significant, because California pulls that power away from the legislators. And they have an independent citizens board that draws up the district lines. And so in that way, maybe those are the kinds of reforms, not just campaign finance, maybe not just term limits, which we talked about before, which I don't want to get into, but maybe things like that in addition to a plethora of
you know
other
that redistricting
possibilities.
has gone on exactly once, and we haven't seen yet how it can be manipulated. I think we'll see it in the year 2020.
But
No, I think
redistricting is not a corruption.
That's
it's not a
not
form of
corruption.
corruption.
Yeah, I don't know why you're
Yeah,
always
no,
on
there's abuse of
redistricting.
power that
No, it
takes
is.
place through the redistricting process when the people who are in charge of that process have the most to gain from drawing the
Absolutely.
line.
Now, let me
And
ask
it
you
is, I
this.
think it is a form of
Here's
corruption.
what I
It
was
is.
going to ask Miriam.
It's
here.
unethical.
It is.
Whether it's illegal or not, doesn't, you know, it's unethical.
Back to
But
her
her
definition.
main point is correct, which is there is no one silver bullet that's going to cure corruption other than, you know, divine grace or something. But short of that, we have multiple programs, but we actually know what they are now. There was the Quinn Commission or the Collins Commission report. There was the Mayor's Task Force report. I've got 6 studies on my website. There are about 20 or 30 recommendations. We know what has to be done. It's going to take decades to do it. So really, and no incremental change will happen. If you remember when Mayor Richard M. Daley was mayor, every time something would happen, like Alderman Hewells would take a loan from the truck owner, they would pass a new ethics amendment which would say you can't take loans from city contractors. You cannot cure corruption by those kinds of incremental steps. You have to do them comprehensively, and you have to do them together, and you have to most of all have the political will to do it, to be able to accomplish it on a broad scale, because you're changing history or a culture. You're changing the attitude that I expect to give you a bribe to get you as a public official to do something for me. You expect to get a bribe from me in order to do it. As long as we have those expectations, we're not going to make progress.
It doesn't have to be a bribe, it's a favor. In other words,
It's a
you
favor,
campaign for me, you help me, I'm going to help you get a job. So
It's power
politics.
in any of it.
But it doesn't
Let me
have
ask
to
you,
be that
Miriam,
way.
I've been
it doesn't
wanting
have to be that way,
ask
but
you,
it's
If we
always,
transform the culture.
it's always
Go
been
ahead.
that
I'm
way,
sorry, Professor
and we're
Why do you
transitioning
think-
that to something different. But we're in transition.
Well, I'm not even sure we're in
Actually, no, I
transition.
do want to hear. I want to hear your question. Go ahead, please.
why do you think Derek Smith was reelected overwhelmingly?
I think part of the reason why he was is because of the redistricting process. People don't want to lose the person that they
power.
believe is representing them.
They'd only had him
and
for
it doesn't
a
matter.
couple of years.
Well, the people there must.
He was certainly not entrenched. He was a relatively new guy. And
But if the people
see, I don't
perceive
think they
him to
care.
represent their interests,
And if they
then why
elected
would they
him.
want to lose him?
Even though he's under indictment for taking a $7,000
That might
bribe.
be something
I
that the
imagine
people
they
believe
all
is
think
oblique
he's innocent,
to.
right?
I'm not
They
saying that's
all
right.
think he's innocent, right?
Well, I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that because of civic shutout, because we don't allow the kind of ballot access that would produce healthy competition at the polls, because of and part of that problem goes back to redistricting, because we basically the incumbents basically redistrict out any potential challenger.
Absolutely.
So
Ballot requirements
so
for the
then you know,
parties.
some people don't want to lose the one person that they believe is representing their interests.
And also, he has after his name the Democratic Party. He was the Democratic
and there's
Party
that, too.
candidate. And this
Absolutely,
is
and it's that
was.
simple for most folks. I mean, it really is. You know, so
It's a straight line party voting, even though, and they believe in it very deeply. Now you got to ask, why do they believe in it?
Well, we have to go ask them.
yeah.
You know,
But I mean, you could talk about.
I have asked,
Yeah.
and you know, it's
What
extraordinary.
have you found out?
I don't care.
You don't care.
And
They
it's-
don't care.
They say, that's the question I hear. Years ago, you remember when Harold Washington was running for various offices before he ran for mayor in 1983, you know, there were all of these difficulties about his failing to file income tax returns. And I had people, both white and black, say to me, I don't care.
Yeah.
I said, if you were to ask them generally, do you think people should file income tax returns? They'd say yes. Would you vote for anybody who didn't file income tax returns? No. now I tell you specifically this person, yes. Well, I don't care because I like him anyway.
Well, that's because politics has really become about personality. And in many ways, leadership is in and of itself, you know? I mean, that's, you know, you look at, there are people, for instance, we just went through a presidential election who may disagree with President Obama on policy issues, but really generally like him, and they vote for him. Our Congressman Jackson Jr. just was elected with 60%, you know, of the population. And I would argue there are a lot of reasons for that. I think there are some cultural reasons. In all honesty, in his situation, there are probably racial reasons as well, and sort of a protectiveness. And then on top of that, there's a lack of competition, I think, which you bring up. I mean, if people don't have another option, what do you expect them to do? And so that, I think, contributes, obviously, to this issue of corruption. So what do we have to do?
Well, there are a whole series of things. I think your suggestion of beginning to implement in public schools a civic education program which is more active, but most of all includes teaching about corruption, the cost of corruption, the cure of corruption. The Pat Collins recommends 4 different changes. One of them is the redistricting change, which we're not going to be able to do anything about for 10 years. There are other changes which, at least on your disclosure issue on campaign finance, some of the races ought to be publicly financed. Judges is a good example.
Absolutely.
If we had at least minimal public financing for judicial races, they would be better. You can go on down the list. There's a series of about 20 things. You know, we can work them out. We can argue about some, like the term limits. But when all is said and done, there are a series of steps. And the main thing is that we want to look for the things that will help, and each will build on the other. Yeah.
And I want to also refer to one of Dick Simpson's recommendations. You know, our local governments are the breeding grounds for folks who go into higher office. And if we don't catch the corruption or the unethical behavior at local government, then we don't really have much to hope for when those folks go up. So I like his idea of having a suburban inspector general in the suburbs. We know that in the suburbs, they're just as corrupt as they are in Chicago.
We found 60, when just looking at convictions, we found 61 suburbs which are corrupt, and we found several hundred public officials who were corrupt, and again, convicted, not even just speculation. And only 5 or 6 different kinds of schemes. They're actually something only like 10 different patterns of corruption in Illinois.
You're talking about the kind of classes that need to be taught for students. I think ethics is at the core of this. And, you know, I mean, ethics it's never really been taught in school, and the classics, you know, usually harbor or hold ethics, and at the university level, I think at UIC where we teach, the classics department has been made into basically
almost non-existent.
Non-existent.
Thank you, Nick. I think we're actually out of time now, but thank you very much. Yeah, this is very. We keep talking about this. One thing that I do think comes down to at its core is really an issue of character, and not only the character of the people that we're electing, but our character and what we look for in people. I mean, you know, not that we would go back to this, but there was, you know, a religion test for public officials, you know, years ago for a reason, in terms of reaching out to figure out what kind of character people had. And so we've got to talk about ways to do that. And for whatever reason, people who are narcissistic and who are self-promoting typically tend to gravitate towards politics. And so we've got to support those who are doing the right things, encourage them. We've got to look for folks who have good character. So thank you all very much. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation, and I look forward to another one hopefully soon.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you.
That's our show for today. Join us next time on The Professors.